the ultimate responsible factor here is the housing situation of any community. And so there's lots and lots of other things, obviously, that need to be implemented to make sure that housing's effective and that it works well for each individual. However, the roof over their head, as Maslow's hierarchy of needs would say, that safety and security is the baseline factor for people to build up the rest of their lives.
Hey, Big Ideas Raleigh listeners. I'm Dan Bagley, your friendly neighborhood enthusiast and proud City of Raleigh employee. Also joining me on the 12th floor of One City Plaza building downtown is the wonderful producer, Dr. Sarah Glova. How you doing today, Sarah?
Hey, Dan. I'm so excited to be all the way up here on the 12th floor.
Oh, it's a great view, right?
Great view.
Of course, you can't see it right now because the curtains are closed, but it's still a great view.
You know what? We're going to make sure to include a clip of the view. So if you're watching on YouTube, don't worry. We'll throw that in later.
That's a great idea. We're also thrilled that you're here today with us because we're diving into one of Raleigh's biggest conversation topics, housing. As our city grows rapidly, so does the need to discuss housing availability, affordability, and accessibility. We're recording this episode to explore the people and programs supporting these conversations. Joining me with this very important conversation are two of Raleigh's leading experts. Emila Sutton, the Housing and Neighborhoods Director for the City of Raleigh. Emila, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And Stephen Gruver, Director of Social Services at the Salvation Army. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, we like to have a little fun to break the ice, and we play a game called Two Facts and a False. So the idea is you have to pick the false answer out of three choices. Now, here's the good news. I'm going to let you guys play together, but you're going to be playing against Sarah. All right?
Dr. Sarah.
Dr.
Right?
Sarah.
That's not intimidating. Let's do it.
All right, here we go. Fact number one, or is it a fact? Housing affordability has reached a crisis point in many U.S. cities, with millions of Americans spending more than 30% of their income on housing, a threshold that defines them as cost-burdened. Number two, the housing crisis only affects low-income individuals and families, as middle and high-income households are largely unaffected by rising home prices and rents. Or three, the U.S. housing supply has not kept pace with demand and the estimated shortage of 3.8 million homes across the country. All right, so you have to pick what is the false statement.
Do y'all want to go first or you want me to have to guess first?
You go.
Well, and to be clear, this is not what my PhD was in. So it helps me exactly zero amount in this. But after listening, the second one sounds wrong to me because even though I feel like so many issues, folks who are experiencing lower income would be more affected. I don't think that this is a problem that affects one group. I think it affects everyone. So I'm leaning toward number two, but the number of estimated homes in number three also sounded really small. I'll go with number two as being the false.
Okay.
All right, what do y'all think?
Number two, got it.
I think that's what I was going to guess as well, just because I think it's so much more complex than just like affecting one population. And specifically, like I think, you know, when there's more individuals that are experiencing homelessness, it affects business in the community, it affects every outlying factor. And so I think that would have been my primary guess. But once again, I agree the shortage might be a little off base there.
Yeah, I think there might need to be an updated count, but I agree with two. Affordability and homelessness impacts all of us.
Well, guess what? All three of you are correct. Well done.
Go team.
You nailed it. And it's for the exact reasons you're talking about. It's false because the housing crisis affects people across various income levels. So yeah, you're spot on. Well done. Well, that was fun. Now we want to know a little bit more about what it is that you guys do. So if you could take just a couple minutes and if you can speak to me like I'm a 4-year-old and tell me what it is that you do on your day-to-day. Let's start with you, Emila.
Oh, okay, sure. All right.
4-year-old.
I know. Like, this is
Okay,
really
we can
good
go
exercise.
8-year-old. 8-year-old's cool.
Yeah. Okay. So I am the director of the city's Housing and Neighborhoods Department, which includes 3 different divisions: neighborhood enrichment, community and small business development, as well as code enforcement. And overall, we have a mission to provide safe and affordable and accessible housing to the city of Raleigh residents. Do you want me to dig deep?
That's pretty wonderful.
There's a lot of other things I could say. That's like the very high level.
What were those three again, Emila?
So code enforcement, neighborhood enrichment, which our podcast host here oversees, and community and small business development.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so for the record, we are doing this podcast, and I'm doing it with my boss. So hopefully we rock this one.
No pressure, Dan. You
No
always do such a
pressure
great
at
job.
all.
Yeah. And since
Stephen,
y'all,
you're not my boss, are you?
No, not
Okay,
your
just
boss.
want to make sure.
since y'all are Raleigh folks, before Stephen introduces kind of what he does, can y'all share a bit about where we are so that maybe the non-Raleigh folks know the importance of kind of being on this 12th floor?
Yeah.
The importance of so we're in the city's housing and neighborhoods department offices right now. So this is where mostly all three of those divisions. Some of neighborhood enrichment is in the Pathway Center.
No, that's right.
But most of us all have our offices on the 12th floor here.
All the magic happens here.
That's right.
Great.
Yeah. So thank you, Emily. Yeah, no, we'll dive deeper into, what you do and why it's so important, why it's important that you do what you do. But before we do that, let's talk to Stephen a little bit about what it is you do.
Sure. I have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old, so it was in real great context there. So I'm Stephen Gruver. I'm the Director of Social Services for Salvation Army. So I think mostly what I do during the day is working. We tend to focus on families experiencing homelessness. So we have various different programs that are helping, between the largest family shelter in Wake County to outreach programs to helping with people who have food insecurity to a lot of other different items to be able to address their needs. I think one of the reasons I got invited here today is because I'm chair of our Continuum of Care board that focuses on homeless services throughout the community.
Oh, that's fascinating. Can you tell me a little bit about the Continuum of Care group?
Sure. Yeah. So the Continuum of Care is a group of diverse stakeholders. You could be a member. Anyone here sitting at this table could be a member. Typically, it involves all agencies in a community that are working with individuals experiencing homelessness in the community, as well as city and county government, various different faith-based providers, anybody who might be interested in addressing the issues of homeless services within a community.
It sounds like it's a powerhouse of folks.
Yeah, and the way you described it, you made it sound like maybe other communities have a similar group. So we're one of many communities that have a group like this.
Correct. Yeah. So if we're taking away the 8-year-old speech with it, housing and urban development, the federal government requires that every community across the U.S. who receives funding from the federal government has to have a continuum of care. And so it's an easy way, if you're interested in being able to get involved in this issue across cities, across counties, across the whole nation, looking up your local continuum of care.
Wow.
And so is that to look up your local continuum of care? Is it just going on the website? Is there something specific they should search?
Yes. So I think you usually can just Google continuum of care in whatever county that you are in. Our specific one for Wake County is wakenc507.org.
Sometimes they're at the city level. We're at the county level for our continuum of care. HUD has a website too that you can go on. So Housing and Urban Development has a listing of all of the continuum of cares.
Well, that's great.
I knew this would happen. We're just a few minutes in and we already have a way that people can get involved if they're interested in this topic.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, now that we understand a little bit more about what it is you guys do, let's talk about some big ideas. This is the Big Ideas Raleigh podcast, after all. So what's something or a big idea that you're working on right now? And I think we'll start with you this time, Stephen.
Oh, wow. So I think one of the things that I'm most excited about, and I'm sure Emila will touch base on this as well, probably, but we historically in our community, we haven't had necessarily a coordinated effort around individuals who are sleeping in encampments or on the streets. There's been lots of coordination amongst providers, but it's not necessarily been on who is living in this encampment and how do we help those people get housing A lot of times, as you can imagine, encampments just get pushed from place to place based off of just it being an eyesore to the public. And so one of the things that we've been rolling out as a continuum of care and in partnership with the city of Raleigh is really working on helping address the issues of individuals that are staying on the street. So how do we help get medical care there? How do we help get solutions, housing solutions to those individuals rather than just what we call Band-Aid effects, like putting a Band-Aid on it? How do we actually bring a solution to those individuals? So I think that's been one of the biggest ideas in our community is what it takes to do that. And so I'm sure Emila will talk a little bit more about the City of Raleigh's proof of concept project that they're going to be bringing. And our continuum of care has really been trying to help set the groundwork for that. And so we're really excited to be able to see what progress that makes and how we really can help our neighbors on the streets in our community.
That's fascinating. I want to dive a little bit more into that in a bit. But before we do, same question, Emila. What's a really big idea you're currently working on?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, so many things that we do here are huge ideas. Not to upstage big ideas, but I would piggyback on Stephen. I think one of the things that we've really done, and as of late, since I've been in this role, at least since October, is really focus on ending unsheltered homelessness. And like Stephen said, partnering with the COC as well as all of the service providers in the community, advocates and community leaders around this issue to really bring solutions to the table. So again, to repeat, Stephen, it's really about, we know what ends homelessness. It's not a mystery. I would say that's the really great news part of this is that
For sure.
we know exactly what's needed. We know what causes homelessness. We know how to end homelessness. And it's just a matter of getting the resources as well as the coordination in order to address it, to actually get to that, what is called functional zero. So we are working to provide a community-wide planning process over the course of the next 3 or 4 months, as Stephen mentioned, to really coordinate and bring together all of the folks involved in this work to set forth a clear pathway for how do we all move ahead to end homelessness together. And then secondly, we received approval from City Council in May to implement an unsheltered homelessness response pilot. We're calling it Bringing Neighbors Home. And this is an effort, as Stephen mentioned, to permanently house approximately 45 people. That is the amount of funding that we have initially directly from camps, and then decommission those camps and again offer this permanent solution. So people will have direct housing assistance as well as voluntary follow-along support services. So whatever kind of services they may want or need, we will provide those things to include things like case management and additional outreach support. So we're really excited for that. That's really intended to show, like Stephen mentioned, to a proof of concept.
Sure.
So again, we know this is the strategy that works. We've seen it happen all across the country. So again, not a mystery. We know what works and we're going to employ it. And what we want to do is we want to show the community and leadership in this community that if we invest in this way, we can actually achieve functional zero and end homelessness in the city of Raleigh.
So you said functional zero twice now. For our listeners listening, what is functional zero?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we know that there's really always going to be an influx of people that don't have access to affordable housing. Partially, right, because of the shortage that you mentioned at the beginning. There's just a shortage of affordable units. And that is one of the reasons why, and that is actually, homelessness is that housing affordability problem.
Okay.
So there are always going to kind of be folks that are unfortunately, on the verge of or falling into homelessness. And so what functional zero means is that you are able to address their homelessness quickly and efficiently and effectively. So making homelessness a brief, rare, and what's the third?
Non-reoccurring.
Non-recurring, yes. So brief, rare, and non-recurring. And ideally, you don't, and this is HUD's goal, is that you don't have someone experiencing homelessness for more than 30 days.
Oh, okay.
I'll say the other big idea that we also are implementing is we're going to continue doing some diversion and prevention work. So the city also, the council approved funding for continuing a pilot for homelessness prevention and diversion. So we're excited to grow that and to build on the work that was done in the last year as far as city investment is concerned, because that diversion and prevention piece is vital, right? So because there are always going to kind of be folks who have don't have access to affordable housing, being able to provide that prevention funding, and then as well as diverting people from homelessness is really key.
Wow.
I noticed a lot of nods around the description of homelessness isn't a mystery and we know what solves it. For those of us who maybe don't have as much experience in this area, and for our listeners who are wondering what has been solved about it, what do we know? What is maybe for you all the kind of answer that's been revealed and that you're working toward? Can you help us understand what do we know about homelessness and the causes, and then the answers to solving it that you all are kind of operating under?
Well, Stephen and I agree on all of this. We could be in chorus on this answer because we've talked about it a lot between us. And, again, homelessness is a housing affordability problem. We know that. We know that financial issues are the primary driver, and the lack of affordable housing is why people become homeless. We also know that issues like mental health and then substance use are triggering factors, right? But if you look at, so we actually just hosted an affordable housing summit, and our keynote speaker was someone named Greg Colburn, who authored the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. Highly recommend that book.
He was wonderful. Wonderful.
That's great. And he was amazing. And there's actually a really great podcast Stephen and I love too, where Greg is on, and you can get a very short snippet of his book. And you can also watch the recording on YouTube from the summit.
That's a good point.
He really shows that the differences in homelessness rates regionally, again, are due to the lack of affordable housing and the lack of vacancies. So, it's domestic violence, mental health, divorce, a spouse passing, all of these things are triggering.
Yeah.
And actually mental health and substance use issues can often be exacerbated by experiencing homelessness, but it's really that lack of affordable housing. So, for example, there's not more people in Portland and Seattle where you see higher rates of unsheltered homelessness. It's not that there's more people that have mental health issues or substance use issues. That's just not fact.
Okay.
It's the fact that there's less affordable housing in those areas as to why there are more people experiencing homelessness. But the book is really great. He debunks a lot of common mythology around weather, around mental health, substance use, all of these things that people, I think, commonly believe to be the reason why homelessness happens. And it is true. I think he does a really great job of sort of parsing out all of these different, lending factors without discounting someone's personal experience, because people will quite often say this is the reason why, which is true. But, at the same time, so because of that, just kind of I feel like I'm dominating here, but Stephen does a really great job of describing all of this too, probably much better than me. But because we know that homelessness is a housing problem, we also know that it's ended with permanent housing, right? So someone's homelessness is ended with housing.
Okay.
That is how you end homelessness. Now, providing voluntary follow-along services is really vital and key in stabilizing folks. However, services alone, so providing someone, like, for example, a job who's experiencing homelessness, or mental health services or substance use, that doesn't end their homelessness, right? What ends their homelessness is housing.
Okay.
And then being able to provide the support in order for someone to stabilize in that housing.
Yeah.
Please, Stephen.
Well, I would just say I think that was really eloquently said altogether. I'd only add a couple different things. I think the first thing I would add in general is that one of my favorite quotes from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, they talk about how 99% of people that are experiencing mental health crises are housed, not homeless. 99% of people that are experiencing substance use are housed, not homeless.
Right.
99% of people that are experiencing job loss are housed, not homeless.
Right.
And so I think their point in driving that home really is that homelessness in and of itself is not due to any one of those criteria.
Right.
That the easiest, there's very few one-to-one correlations in our line of work altogether, but I think the best one-to-one correlation that we can find in our line of work is around vacancy rates. So if you have a low vacancy rate in a city, you have a high percentage of homelessness per capita and per a population. If you have a high vacancy rate in a city, then you're going to have a lower homeless rate in your community. And so I think what Emila just said was perfect. The ultimate responsible factor here is the housing situation of any community. And so there's lots and lots of other things, obviously, that need to be implemented to make sure that housing's effective and that it works well for each individual. However, the roof over their head, as Maslow's hierarchy of needs would say, that safety and security is the baseline factor for people to build up the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
No, that's fascinating, because what it sounds like to me is it's a big jigsaw puzzle, but ultimately the biggest piece is if you don't have a house, then you're homeless.
Right.
Yeah.
You have the house, then everything else is just you're
Sounds
working
almost
on.
too simple.
I know,
right?
it does. It does.
I know,
But-
it's true.
That's fascinating. Well, I'd like to steer this a little bit in a different direction really quickly, because you had mentioned about housing encampments and how the continuum of care and the new Bringing the Neighbor Home program, it looks like are they coming together to work on this? I mean, and you said there were 45 individuals that will be pulling from a specific camp. What does that look like? How are you guys tackling this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I think it's important to also talk about the proliferation of camps in the city over just the last 3 years.
Yeah,
So we
please.
know that the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness has at least doubled. We actually think that number is probably a lot higher. And so part of the Continuum of Care's efforts right now is to really get a good sense of how many people are we talking about? What are the needs of people out there? How are we able to address them? How are we able to find folks so that we can address their homelessness? And so it's really risen a lot, right? Just in recent years. And I think anyone with eyes can really see that.
Sure.
And so I think we're really at this inflection point in the city of Raleigh, where either we build in infrastructure to achieve functional zero and to put forth these permanent solutions to homelessness, or we go down a path of where other cities have gone, which is where we are just managing the issue. So, for example, investing heavily in things like day shelters or even drop-in shelters. These are, I'll say that, first of all, shelters are a vital part of our community system. They offer a foundational health and safety response, right? So we really need those pieces. However, what we don't want to do is focus all of our efforts in those temporary solutions, right? We want to create a system flow. So we're getting people out of those shelters directly into permanent housing. And so we want to create an infrastructure that is able to respond very quickly and immediately, efficiently, and effectively with these permanent solutions to unsheltered homelessness. So that is part of, again, what the pilot is going to show. If you do take the number of people that we know are experiencing unsheltered homelessness right now, which is just over 450, which again, undercount.
Right.
It costs approximately $24,000 a year to provide someone with rent assistance. That is considerably lower, by the way, and we can talk more about this. And Stephen has a lot of great talking points on this too, but that's considerably lower than actually doing nothing. So a person experiencing homelessness, for example, can cost our community due to emergency care, justice involvement, anywhere from $36,000 a year to $96,000 a year in community services. However, housing that person, again, is $24,000 per year per person. So if you take that 450 number, you multiply it by that. I think the last time I did that math, it was like 11 million or something like that.
Wow.
And so if you think about the investment that the city could make to actually end homelessness year over year right now. I mean, we can do this. This is not something outside of what we can do. And so what we want is the pilot to really say, look, we were able to,
prove the numbers.
Yeah, exactly. So we're excited to do that. We only have a small amount of money, again, for the pilot, but we really hope that it will reflect that this is what this community needs in order to really solve this issue.
But you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So we're ready to start. And so we, so the city also, there's a proliferation of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness on city parks property. in particular. So we are working a lot with the Parks Department, with Acorns, RPD, Transportation. We have an interdepartmental work group that meets monthly to talk about how we address unsheltered homelessness. And one of the things that the Parks Department noted was the huge increase of the number of people that are living in their car or on the, in a tent or whatever it may be, living unsheltered in Parks Department property. And so part of this response is hopefully going to address those areas. So where the city owns the land, we have a lot more control, right? But where, for example, the county owns or a private owner, they could just call RPD and say, move
Raleigh
folks
Police
along,
Department.
trespass people. But for city-owned property, we can say, hey, let's bring this whole coordinated group together. Let's talk about exactly how to permanently solve this issue and coordinate and work together to do it. So that's part of what the pilot is going to do.
Well, that's amazing. And Stephen, your group, when you come across an encampment, what's happening? What are you doing? How does this continuum of care help them? What's the first step?
That's an excellent question. I think we could talk a little bit about the history of work around encampments. I think just in general, most cities' responses across the nation have been just no trespass people and close down an encampment, get rid of all the items that were left in there.
Didn't the federal government just create a new law as well?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, what's this one? As someone who is less involved in this, please share.
Yeah. Do you want to share a little bit about it?
Well, so the Supreme Court recently ruled that essentially, I'm going to oversimplify it for the audience, but essentially that
for me,
homelessness, it can be criminalized.
Yeah.
So it allows for municipalities to treat homelessness as a criminal offense, right? And so I think now in the city, we are really lucky to have RPD as partners and Parks and all of those other departments that I mentioned and Acorns just doing incredible work every day on the front lines with folks. And so, again, we're lucky to be in that situation in the city of Raleigh, especially considering the Supreme Court decision. But absolutely, it does offer, it's another piece that makes things a little harder.
Right.
And you've
Potentially.
mentioned
Definitely
Acorns a couple times. I know we're going to talk about community partnerships in just a minute. That's one I'd love to hear shared. But something else that I just want to make sure we have some time on this, because as somebody who doesn't do this work every day, something that stuck out to me, Stephen, the numbers that you shared to back up some of the points that Emila was sharing, it's really interesting because if we take the topic out of this, so if we say that we're talking about a budget item and the choice is to invest $11 million, that's a number. But it's not a choice of spending that $11 million or not spending that $11 million, because there is not an option to kind of spend nothing. And I'm using air quotes here for those of us who aren't watching on YouTube, but to quote unquote, spend nothing, because Stephen, you alluded that if we don't invest in this, that there is a cost. And I think this is a really important piece of this argument that even separates us from the issue of housing, which is what we're here to talk about today, but to understand from a budget standpoint of the investment idea. As we look at the numbers, there's not an option to quote unquote spend nothing. So can you just help make sure we understand that? What does that mean?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's a solution. The solution for this is both helping a community monetarily as well as humanitarianly. That's the right word for that.
Yeah.
So I think the around the numbers question, I'll give you an example. So when I worked previous to moving to North Carolina, I worked in Santa Barbara, California. And in Santa Barbara, we had this pilot focused on the highest utilizers on the streets. So we took the 10 highest individuals who were in and out of the emergency room and in and out of jail and in and
so
costing
highest utilizing a lot of services.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fascinating.
Yeah, utilizing shelter. We took the price point of what it costs to provide someone shelter daily and their food and all the different things that it costs communities and taxpayer dollars ultimately to be able to provide that service. And so then we put a number on those 10 individuals. And when we got the math back, it was about $5 million those 10 individuals were costing between services within a year period. So, I mean, an ER visit being $3,000. And I think usually when we chose the numbers, we chose them pretty conservatively in general for the amount. And so the proof of concept there was saying, hey, if we can put Jimbo, who's living on the streets, I always use Jimbo as my example for it, who's been in and out of the ER, in and out of jail, been in the shelter when he's not in there, has medically fragile presuppositions because of being exposed to the elements.
Okay.
If we can put Jimbo in housing and do wraparound services with him, Jimbo now has a place to get consistent substance use treatment, now has a place to get consistent mental health treatment, now has a place to like allow the stress and the eating and wear on his body from 30 years of being on the streets to start to recover from that. Then we can help Jimbo not go to the ER as much, not go to jail because of illegal lodging tickets, like we were just talking about, not go to the shelters and having to do that as a costly intervention on a nightly basis. And so it really just affordability wise also, it ends up costing so much less for individuals to be in housing rather than on the streets. Now, obviously, there's a lot of complications around that. You have to do the wraparound services well. You have to help individuals learn how to gain back their life, how to transition from being on the streets 30 years to now being in housing and being a productive member of our community. And so there's a lot of work on the back end, but in the long term, we can really show those numbers, not just it being a humanitarian response, which I would argue is also our responsibility as a community altogether, but also a financial response for us as a community in the long run.
It's beautiful because I think even though we agree about the idea of this, as we're just thinking about how we want as a community to treat our neighbors, to treat fellow humans, there's easy arguments. But if we take the descriptions and the topic out of it, there's even a very clear mathematical argument. And I would argue this is math that, our 8-year-olds could do. And I know we're oversimplifying it a little bit when we just look at it's a plus and minus, but it's a really interesting, especially for those of us who are entering this argument, because as Emila alluded to, many of us, we see that there's a problem that's getting worse in Raleigh. And there's going to be a lot of opinions about how to handle it. But for those of us who are entering the conversation with concerns for our community, if we can understand that there isn't an option to pay nothing, there isn't an option to invest nothing in this, that isn't available to us, and that we're talking about the numbers in a way of this actually could save taxpayer money.
That's right.
Really
I'd like to add one little thing there too. I think even you had asked me earlier about the encampment strategy. Historically, I was saying that the encampment, our strategy has just been shut them down, right? Well, shutting down an encampment is actually a really cost burdensome solution. I think if you all remember the one around 540, about a year ago, is a huge capital in 540. I think that ended up costing around $50,000, $60,000 just to clean up. And what we know about individuals and neighbors that are on the streets is they're not going anywhere with it. So if we're just going to shut it down, they're just going to move to a different location and start back up. And so I think outside of the numbers, outside the humanitarian, there is just a practical standpoint to what you were alluding to is really we have to have a strategy around solving this, not just pushing people on. And so
I can add specific numbers to cleanup costs too. So the North Carolina Department of Transportation told us in the last year they've spent roughly $200,000 to clear camps in the city of Raleigh. And the city's parks department spent about that much in the last year as well. So if you think about $400,000 of public dollars just going towards trespassing people, and it further traumatizes folks, right? I mean, this is where people live. This is the only place they have to go. And so you're moving people to another location where they have to set up camp again under constant threat of being moved and trespassed again, and it's costing us, over the course of a year. And those are probably really conservative estimates too, right? Just $400,000 just to clean up and sort of move people around.
And via your math, that 24 divided by that 400, I mean, that's 12, 14 people that could have been housed.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think about, just for 2 seconds, when you were talking about people who have been out on the streets for 30 plus years, think about a day where I'm outside and I'm working a special event for just a day.
I know.
And I'm wrecked for the next couple days after that. Well, with that, we need to take a quick break and we'll be right back with the Big Ideas Raleigh podcast. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Big Ideas Raleigh podcast. I have with me Emila Sutton, Housing and Neighborhoods Director, and Stephen Gruver, Director of Social Services with the Salvation Army, and we have a great conversation going on today. I want to jump right back into this. I'd love to know from both of you, and Stephen, we'll start with you. Can you explain how things like zoning, credits, and vouchers play a role in creating more housing options?
I'll probably leave the zoning portion to Emila.
That's fair.
but I do think I think in general, when we're talking about vouchers and subsidies, so I like to do this just by painting a picture a little bit, right? Say you're a single mom and you have 4 kids and you have your high school diploma. You're doing good to make about how much in Raleigh? 15 an hour?
15, 16.
16
Okay.
an hour
Yeah.
with it. So how do you pay for childcare? How do you pay for rent in our community? And so I think when you get to kind of put yourself in the shoes of individuals that we serve, you really get to see the disparities that our community faces. Like this mom would have to work 200 plus hours a week to be able to afford even the lowest threshold of housing, because most property managers require 3 times the rent. So to even be able to get to there. So when we're talking about things like subsidy, a lot of the work that we do require the subsidy portion, even for our families to succeed in general. And so our hope as the community and as social workers and things like that is to really be working with these individuals so that they don't need subsidy in the long run. But from the base standpoint, that subsidy, like housing choice vouchers or first month's rent and security deposit or different things like that are going to help a person get into a unit and be able to sustain the cost of that, is like the baseline level of support that a family might need. I think there's all sorts of national studies on the shortage of subsidy and housing choice vouchers in a community, and I'll let him touch on that a little more. But I think ultimately our goal is really to be able to provide the support that we can for those individuals that we're serving, whether in encampments or shelters or just in poverty in our community who need those levels of support.
Great.
Yeah, I can put some numbers.
Please.
I think what's really interesting to note about voucher programs is that only about 25% of people who are eligible for voucher programs there's only that many vouchers in the world, right? So actually have and are able to access a voucher. This is much different than other federal programs that are quote unquote entitlement programs. So for things like SNAP, so that's the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program.
Right.
So for what was traditionally known as food stamps, people who are eligible for that can receive it. That is an entitlement program. If you are eligible, you receive it. But for housing, it's a lottery. I mean, you have to get so lucky to get one of these vouchers. And then there are all different kinds of barriers that people face even when they have a voucher. So in many communities, including ours, I think for a variety of reasons, there are landlords who won't accept vouchers. So not only are your choices limited as far as you've got to find a unit that's within a certain price range with that voucher, you got to hit the lottery to even get that voucher, right? Is you have to find a landlord who's willing to accept that voucher. So there's a large percentage, I would say, of folks, I think it's around 30%, of people with vouchers in hand who cannot find a unit and whose vouchers expire because they just can't find a landlord. So we're just talking about layers of different barriers.
And
for
not to
folks.
mention all the time that it takes to do the applications for some of these services. What's really interesting, and this is a little personal for our City of Raleigh podcast, but what Stephen doesn't know is he's sharing the example that he shared is, I was raised by a single mom with a high school education, and I'm one of 4 girls. And when we moved to this area, we really struggled to find a place to live. And to the point about what you shared, Emila, we didn't have time. This is where we needed to be located after my mom got laid off and she was looking for opportunities. there wasn't time to apply to something like
Exactly.
that. Now, at that time, we were able to find an affordable apartment out in Apex because the community was very different. And I won't say how many years ago that I moved here, but the community was different. That we were able to find some housing out there in Apex. But when we talk about making it real, making these stories real, what's also interesting to me, and I think we highlighted this a little bit when we talked about who's affected by housing, and that it's not always substance abuse or mental health or job loss. I think that there are so many more people in our community who either are affected or are at risk of being affected. The line is, especially as costs are going up and folks are not as financially resilient as maybe we've seen in past decades. This is something that really could affect our neighbors so much more quickly than I think many of us are aware of. And so when we talk about it and we only picture maybe a stereotype of who homelessness affects, I think it makes it a problem that we maybe feel like we don't have to think about every day. Right. But when we put it in this context and make the stories more real and really look at who could be at risk of needing to use some of these services and realizing how unavailable or unrealistic they are, it becomes a bigger conversation that more people can be a part of.
Yeah, 100%. And just to be clear, and thank you for sharing that, Sarah. So what you're saying is 1 out of 4 will hit the lottery, and of those 1 out of 4, only about 30% are actually able to find a place that will take the vouchers, or it's extremely difficult to find places.
70%, 30% will not be able to find.
So only 70% out of that 1 out of 4.
Yes.
Wow, that is crazy when you start thinking about that math as well.
Right.
Well, thank you for sharing that. We've mentioned a couple things, Acorns, RPD. What role do community partnerships play in taking on these challenges? And are there any collaborations that really stand out to you guys?
I'll just shout out, since I've been using acronyms, I apologize. I will just say that, so the Raleigh Police Department has sort of under Acorns, which stands for, I had to look it up because I always forget, addressing crises through outreach, referrals, networking, and service. That is the community's outreach team that is housed in the Raleigh Police Department, which is what I've been calling RPD. So they are incredibly important in all of this. I do also just want to shout out that something I say often is the city of Raleigh is only one piece of this puzzle, right? We can't end homelessness alone. We have to have coordinated, proactive efforts throughout the entire community and coordination in order to address this, because we don't have all of the resources here, right? Mm-hmm. So the county is a huge lead in this space. And so we work with the county. They house the social services for the community. And so we currently work with them. We actually did sort of a micro pilot just a couple of weeks ago, where we housed folks, about 5 people experiencing homelessness on a camp on county-owned property. We were able to house folks in partnership with them. But I just say that to say, so that the continuum of care and all of those partner agencies involved there, all of the people who are doing street outreach and homelessness services have to be involved. And then we would love to see the private community also be involved in this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nate, we had a speaker from New Orleans come at the Affordable Housing Summit, and he talked about how they have addressed unsheltered homelessness, and they've reduced it by 12% in a very short period of time through providing people with permanent housing directly from street to housing. And he was talking about how they have a privately funded flex fund. And this is very important for what Stephen mentioned about accessing units. So, federal funds, city funds can be limited as to what they can do. But if you have private funds, you can do really flexible things to meet the household specific needs. So if someone needs an application fee paid for, which can be pretty high, a security deposit, that 3 times the rent that Stephen was talking about in order to access housing. This sort of flex fund could be something that could help provide for that. So just wanted to mention, I think it's really like private and public, and including all of us.
So you said county and RPD. Stephen,
I would echo those. I'd add some more too. I definitely think Wake County's done some wonderful work in this space over the last few years. They have a program called Bridge to Home. That's also been a really big staple for our community to be able to even start to address this issue ultimately. Our continuum of care is comprised of over 50 agencies and partners, and we would love to have even more membership. So anyone who's interested, please visit that website. But to Emila's point, if you've been in this space long enough, you know this isn't just like a one-person issue. Like this is a community issue, as corny as is, takes the village issue, right? Like you have to have all of the different partners at play to be able to bring the solutions. And the example I'll give to that, when I was referring to that project I worked for in Santa Barbara, we would have weekly case management meetings, and we would bring the business community to the table, because the business community is seeing a different side of this, right? They're seeing how their funds are affected because of Jimbo who's sleeping out in front of their streets or in front of their store, and how that affects the business that they're doing. Well, they might be willing to dedicate financial resources, solutions, employment to Jimbo to be able to get him a solution of housing. And that way their business is able to function more effectively. And so we really need, I think historically, we've had the government and the nonprofit partners in general in that, but we need those philanthropic partners. We need the faith communities to really step into this space and help us bring solutions, because we're just one piece of the puzzle. And so there really has to be a community-wide effort around this in order for us to shift the story that's been going on, I guess.
So what you're saying is the best way. So if someone listening to this podcast right now, they wanted to help. The best way to do that is for one to go to this continuum of care and just send you a note.
I love this question. So I'll put two out there right
Please.
now. The first one would be to go to wakenc507.org. You can sign up to be a membership. You can sign up for newsletters to find out just what's happening in the space. You can visit committees where the real work's happening, the ground level work. You're able to do that. The other one I'd offer is, we just talked about homelessness as a housing issue, right? And we talked about how in this space we need more affordable housing. We just need more housing in general.
Right.
And so if you know someone who is a property manager, a landlord, and you're willing to step into this space to be able to take a chance and to help our neighbors who are on the streets be able to find adequate housing, whether it's market rate, whether it's lower than market rate, whatever it is, I would encourage you as well to reach out to the continuum of care, because we definitely would have agencies that would be willing to plug in as quickly as possible. And we need that. I mean, if we don't have that, ultimately we just have a bunch of services and no housing.
Yeah.
So
it still comes down to that.
Yeah.
There's no housing. If you don't have housing, you can't solve the problem.
That's right.
And I know affordable housing is another topic that we are excited to get into another time, but having you all speak to that and the importance of that and allowing us to amplify that, because I know that's a big concern of many of us who live here in Raleigh. So thank you for that. And the continuum of care, just having a board member here with us
Yes.
to encourage that really anyone can go and
Right.
submit an interest for membership. That's really helpful to know.
great.
So hopefully you get an influx of membership requests.
I hope so.
Well, we have one more question for you guys. And you know what? I take that back. I do want to ask one real quick question of you, Stephen. I go up and down Capitol Boulevard, coming home, going to work every day. And I can't help but notice there are large numbers of folks right outside your building every morning when I'm coming in. What's that about? Why are all those folks there?
Thanks for asking. I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't even get to mention my agency too much on this. So that's great. I think one of the things we have the largest family shelter in Wake County. But one of the things our community decided to implement about a year ago was we said, hey, it's not okay for people to be on the streets. It's not okay for them to not have a roof over their head. So there was a few different agencies that stepped up to just say, hey, we're going to provide what's called emergency drop-in shelter. Not only are we going to provide a program that's helping people really get back on their feet, but we're just going to provide a safe place to sleep at night.
That's great.
And we stepped up to do that for families in our community. And so if you're a family and you're experiencing homelessness, you can show up at our door. We provide a cot. It's just a night by night bed. So it's first come, first serve. And but the amazing thing about that for us as a community is we just stepped up and as a response of saying, like, we want to make sure that everyone in our community has a safe place to sleep. And so we utilize our building, our common spaces, our classrooms, every inch of our building to be able to provide that space. And so in the morning is when the emergency drop-in shelter closes so that we can provide business and be able to do the rest of our programming. So you see a lot of families transitioning out of our shelter at that time. We're really excited to be able to offer that for the community. And one thing I will say, as we've offered that, we've seen the need, the true need, right? Because if you're willing to come in at 5 o'clock and check in and leave at 7:30 every morning, you're really in need of that space. And we've actually hit capacity over the last few months where we're serving an additional 90 people in that program alone. And that's just ours. So St. John's, MCC, and Healing Transitions have both stepped up for single individuals, and they've been serving over a couple hundred people each night through that space.
Yeah, they've also seen an incredible, I would say exponential increase in the need for that. And again, drop-in. I mean, it's incredible what these community partners stepped up to be able to provide these health and safety solutions for folks. We want to alleviate that. I mean, we want to house folks so that people they're not overburdened. There aren't people lined up, that this is not something that is a reality in our community. We're incredibly appreciative for the way that these providers have stepped up to provide that.
And that's one kind of shelter, and those have taken partnerships. We also have the white flag shelters. Can we briefly share what that is and how that's different?
Yeah, so this idea actually started out of the White Flag work group. It's called the Housing or Homelessness Emergency Response Committee for our COC. And what they did, White Flag is just saying when it's days of extreme temperature, whether it's under 32 degrees, where mortality rate is actually pretty high if individuals are on the streets, or over 100 degrees where mortality rate's high, the shelters in Wake County will open up their space to be able to provide just respite from that, whether it's at night. And the idea behind that was really to prevent people from dying on the streets. And so our community took that a step further in this drop-in shelter idea. And to Emila's point, one thing that we say is that roof over their head is a crucial, essential service. However, it's not the solution, right? Just building more shelter isn't going to solve people's homelessness. The housing's the focus. The shelter's just the temporary respite, the safety.
The Band-Aid you were talking about.
And it's making sense to me, and I'll say it one more time, just as someone who doesn't do this every day, this conversation has been so helpful to understand more about it. I understand that when we talk about shelters, it's a part of this. Almost if you can picture any hospital system. Sure, there's an ER room or a triage, but we don't create a successful hospital by only adding to that. We need these other services, and not everyone is going to need all of them, but we're not going to build a successful hospital just by building more ER services.
Exactly.
That's not going to be enough. And so it makes sense to me that while the shelters are an important piece, it is a piece, and there's a lot more involved in this.
Great analogy.
Exactly. Yeah, that is a great analogy. One that we use sometimes. So it's incredible that just came into your head.
Well, we want to thank you guys, but before we let you go, we'd really love to know what's something we haven't talked about today that you would love to share with everyone listening to the podcast.
How much time do we have?
For you, Emila, as much as you want.
Don't tempt me with a
He
good
says
time.
to his boss.
I know. No, I just, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Dan, that I just want to circle back to is about zoning and of the importance of deregulation and making sure that our housing market can be what is called elastic and responsive. So one of the things that Greg Colburn talks a lot about in his book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, is even where communities have less regulatory barriers, so less zoning requirements, for example, there's less homelessness. So where affordable housing can be, provided more readily, you have less homelessness. In the city, we are providing gap financing for one of the largest federal tools that we have to build affordable housing, which is called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. So the city, as well as the county, provides gap financing for those projects. But we need more. We have about 7,000 units since 2016 that are either on the ground or in the pipeline, which is incredible, but in no way meeting the need, right?
Which is unfortunate.
So we need all different kinds of solutions, and we need additional resources, and we need to think about how regulations impact what housing can and can't be built where.
So again, more zoning equals less house. So less zoning equals more houses equals less homelessness.
You nailed it. At a very high level, that's exactly right.
Yes. There's no other pieces to this puzzle. That's it. No, of course.
I know it would make both of your jobs easier if that were true. And I think we've alluded to this, but what a great topic for a future episode, because there's so much more to dive into there. But thank you for continuing to bring it up, but allowing us to really focus on what we wanted to talk about today, which is just this homelessness. I feel comfortable using the word crisis after we've talked about the exponential increase in need. And it was really helpful to discuss it in a way that even folks like me, who we're aware that there is an issue, but we don't know enough about what's going on behind the scenes. It does still feel like a mystery to us sometimes. You both did such a great job of walking us through that. Stephen, anything else you'd want the community to know?
The first was the plug for landlords and property managers. Just want to say that again. We need you.
Absolutely.
The second portion I would just say is, there's been some really, really cool studies around income gap for a community. And without diving too deep into that, I think just figuratively, we know, right, that income has grown exponentially for people who are higher income and has grown very little over 20 years for people who are lower income. However, the apartment rent and the cost of mortgages has grown exponentially altogether. And so it just doesn't align up. And I think my point in bringing this up is really this isn't just it is a one item solution of housing, but it's not just a one implementation. As successful as the city of Raleigh's encampment strategy is going to be, as successful as Wake County's Bridge to Home program has been, as successful as the voucher program has been, it's not just a one solution. We really need a system, a continuum of care for our neighbors on the streets that is implementing various different strategies on different parts. And so Emila alluded to this earlier, but like preventing people from entering the system in general, like how do we help people who are just a few months behind on rent be able to pay that rent, because we know it's going to be more costly for them to become homeless than it is for us to just provide that intervention there? Or how do we help them if they have any other solution outside of entering a shelter or in our emergency crisis system? How do we help them be able to achieve that solution in our community, which would be diversion? And so we really need a community and a system that's helping to address all of those different areas. And so as we talk about these complex issues, I would just say everyone has a role to play in that. And I think we've got to figure out where ours is and how we can help do better for our community and do better for our neighbors who are living within our community on the streets.
Well, it seems like the data is here now, and it's really easy to show with the data that the numbers do add up if we really take a look at it.
Yeah.
And we take those opportunities and those chances to really sink our teeth into ending homelessness. So with that, I would like to thank both you, Stephen and Emila, for being here today. Yeah. It was a wonderful show. I learned a lot. And Sarah,
you learned a lot. I feel like I just went to class. That was great. And just a couple producer notes. I mean, we mentioned this book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And you mentioned the author,
Greg Colburn.
And he spoke at the summit that you mentioned. And there is a recording that anyone can go and watch. So we'll put that in the show notes. And then also the COC, or the Continuum of Care, that Stephen is on the board of. We're going to put a link to more information about that as well for folks who are trying to figure out what their piece is, where they are in this conversation. As you mentioned, that's something that we can all figure out. So for folks who are looking into that, they can look into membership.
Thank you,
Can
Sarah.
I add one more thing that I forgot? If you have noticed an encampment in our community, now on our Continuum of Care website, you can report that encampment and we can focus on being able to get those individuals some resources. So
That's amazing.
in your neighborhood, you see people living in tents and just want to provide some basic information on the website, we wouldn't encourage you to enter their space, but we would encourage you to provide that information on our COC website, and we can work on getting those neighbors some resources.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for listening to or watching this podcast. Give us a follow. Find the Big Ideas Raleigh podcast on any podcast app or on YouTube. We've got more great episodes coming your way as we dive deep into the heartbeat of your Oak City. And hey, if you have ideas for our podcast, let us know. Visit our podcast page, learn how you can share your ideas with us. We'd love to hear from you. And a special shout out to the production team behind the podcast, Earfluence, a Raleigh-based podcast production company. Learn more at earfluence.com. This podcast was brought to you by the City of Raleigh's Office of Strategy and Innovation, also known as the Office of Yes and the City of Raleigh's Communication Department. I'm Dan Bagley, and we'll see you next time on the Big Ideas Raleigh podcast.